Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. A young man, struggling with the weight of his debts, is approached by a woman offering him a lifeline he never expected. But little does he know, the simple act of accepting her offer will change the course of his life forever. Let's find out what happens next. Mark Davis was just another college student, drowning in the overwhelming weight of student loans, late payments, and the suffocating pressure of his father's debts. At 23, he was juggling his final year of law school, working a part-time job, and barely scraping by. His phone buzzed, breaking him out of his spiral of thoughts. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." The voice on the other end was calm, composed, and somewhat commanding. Mark frowned, puzzled. He had no idea who this was. "Sorry, who are you? How do you know about me?" he asked, feeling his heart race. "I know enough," she replied smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro at 7 p.m. It's important." The call ended before he could protest. Mark stood frozen for a moment. Who was Eleanor Brooks, and how did she know about his financial troubles? The rain was pouring down heavily as Mark arrived at Brooks Bistro. He stepped inside, drenched from the downpour, and the warmth of the restaurant embraced him, offering a brief respite from the cold. He scanned the room, looking for the woman who had summoned him. At the back of the bistro, he spotted her. Eleanor Brooks. Her silver hair was styled neatly, and her tailored suit screamed wealth and confidence. She looked nothing like the kind of woman who would ever give a second thought to someone like him. But there she was, waiting for him. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Mark, thank you for coming," she said, her voice still calm, almost too calm for someone who was about to offer him the solution to all his problems. Mark hesitated for a moment before sitting down. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. How could this woman possibly help him? His eyes flicked to her, trying to get a sense of what this was all about. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked you here," Eleanor continued, her eyes locked onto his. "I know about your debts. Your father's business left you in a difficult position, and I can help you. But, in return, I need you to help me." Mark frowned, confused. "Help you? How?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "Marry me, Mark." She said it with such ease, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "What? Marry you?" Mark blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. "It's not about love, Mark. It's a business arrangement. If you marry me, I'll pay off all your debts, ensure your financial security, and help you achieve everything you've dreamed of. In return, you will become my companion. Nothing more." Mark sat back, stunned. Marry her? For money? It seemed like an impossible offer, but Eleanor wasn't done. Her voice softened, and she leaned back in her chair. "You're young, unattached, and desperate enough to consider this. I don't need love, Mark. I need someone to share my name, to stand by my side. I've spent my life alone, and now I need control over my legacy. A husband will help solidify that." Mark stared at her, his mind racing. This was crazy. He was a law student barely getting by, and she was offering him a way out. But it felt like a trap. Still, the thought of being free from the burden of his debts, of finally having some security in his life, was too tempting to ignore. "What's in it for you?" he asked, unable to hide the doubt in his voice. Eleanor's expression softened for the first time. "A companion. Someone to help me in ways no one else can. That's all I ask." She pushed a file across the table toward him. Inside was a contract. A promise. Everything he could ever want, if he agreed to her terms. Mark picked up the contract, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain outside continued to beat down against the windows as he stared at the words on the page. He knew what he had to do. He had no other options, no other way to save himself and his future. The choice was clear. He looked up at Eleanor, finally meeting her gaze. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll do it. I'll marry you." Eleanor smiled, the kind of smile that promised everything and nothing at the same time. "Good," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's get started, then." With that, Mark signed the contract, sealing his fate in a decision that would change his life forever. What began as a simple business deal quickly began to transform into something more. Something neither of them expected. As the days passed, Mark tried to keep his distance, to remind himself that this was just a contract. But somewhere along the way, he started to see Eleanor in a new light. The woman who had once seemed so distant, so cold, was beginning to reveal the warmth underneath. And as for Eleanor, she too began to feel something she hadn't anticipated, a connection, a pull towards Mark that went beyond the terms of their agreement. But would they dare to confront what was growing between them? The rain had finally stopped as Mark made his way back to his small, cramped apartment. His mind was still reeling from the meeting with Eleanor Brooks. He couldn't shake the feeling that everything had happened too quickly. One moment, he was drowning in debt, struggling to make ends meet, and the next, he was signing a contract to marry a woman he had just met. The weight of the decision sat heavy on his shoulders as he unlocked his apartment door and stepped inside. The place was small, a far cry from the grand bistro where he had just signed his life away. But it was his. It had been his father's before him, and now, it was his responsibility. He sank into the worn-out couch, staring at the walls, his thoughts consumed by the contract in his pocket. Was he really going to go through with this? He had agreed to marry Eleanor, not out of love, but out of necessity. But deep down, he knew that this deal, this arrangement, was a turning point in his life. Later that night, as Mark tried to fall asleep, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Eleanor. "Meet me at my office tomorrow at 9 a.m. We need to finalize the details of our agreement." He stared at the message for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. This was real now. He wasn't sure what he was expecting from Eleanor, but he knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet understand. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his mind kept racing with questions. What was she really after, and more importantly, what would this mean for him? The next morning, Mark stood in front of Eleanor's office building, the towering glass structure reflecting the city's skyline. He had never been inside a building like this, let alone worked in one. He adjusted his tie nervously and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby was pristine, with sleek marble floors and a receptionist who barely looked up as he approached the desk. "I'm here to see Ms. Brooks," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The receptionist nodded without a word and gestured toward the elevator. Mark stepped inside, his stomach tightening with each passing floor. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by a long hallway lined with modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of the city below. At the end of the hallway, Eleanor's office stood like a fortress, a large wooden door that seemed to promise authority and power. Mark knocked lightly before entering. Eleanor was standing by the window, looking out over the city, her silver hair catching the light. She turned as he entered, her eyes studying him for a moment before she spoke. Mark nodded, his throat dry. He had no idea what he was getting himself into. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, this would be a temporary solution, a way out of his financial troubles without any strings attached. But Eleanor was laying out the terms so plainly, so coldly, that it was impossible to ignore the fact that he was stepping into something far more complicated than he had ever imagined. Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile of someone who had done this before, who had everything calculated, who knew exactly what she was doing. "Good," she said, sliding a folder across the desk to him. Here are the final details of our agreement. Once you sign these, we'll begin immediately. Mark looked at the papers, his hand shaking slightly as he reached for the pen. The contract was thick, filled with clauses and fine print, but he didn't care. All he could think about was the life he could have if he agreed to this. The security. The stability. A chance to escape the mess his life had become. As he signed the papers, Eleanor stood and walked to the window, her back to him. Mark could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Was he really doing this? Was he really going to marry someone he didn't love just to escape his debts? But then he thought of his mother, his sister, the promises he had made to them. He thought of the future he could have, the opportunities that would open up for him. He had no choice. He had to do this. As he finished signing, Eleanor turned around, her gaze sharp and calculating. "Welcome to the arrangement, Mark," she said, her voice cold but with an undercurrent of something he couldn't quite place. "Now, we begin." The words hung in the air as Mark stood up, his mind whirling with uncertainty and the weight of the life he was about to enter. As Mark left Eleanor's office and stepped back into the world he had known, he couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep up this charade. He had agreed to marry Eleanor, but in his heart, he knew this was only the beginning. What would happen when the lines between the contract and real emotions started to blur? The following days passed in a blur of meetings and formalities. Mark found himself attending social functions with Eleanor, sitting at high-end tables surrounded by important people, feeling like a fish out of water. He played his part as her husband, no more, no less. At first, it felt like a dream: free meals at the best restaurants, invitations to galas, and an occasional glance from Eleanor that seemed almost warm. But no matter how lavish the events were or how smooth the evenings went, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was living a lie. He wasn't really her husband, he was just a prop, a pawn in a game neither of them had truly explained. The more he attended these events, the more he wondered if he had made the right decision. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a gala she was hosting for charity. Mark had been to a few of these events before, but this time felt different. There was a new level of tension in the air. The grand ballroom was filled with the city's elite people in tuxedos and evening gowns, all mingling, laughing, and exchanging business cards. Mark stood at the edge of the crowd, nursing a glass of champagne, feeling completely out of place. Eleanor was at the center of it all, holding court with the most important guests. She looked regal, effortlessly moving from one conversation to the next, always poised, always in control. Mark watched her for a moment, noticing the way people gravitated toward her, hanging on her every word. There was power in her presence, a kind of magnetic force that he couldn't help but admire. But as much as he admired her strength, he couldn't ignore the coldness in her eyes. She was distant, as if she was always a step ahead of everyone, including him. He was nothing more than an accessory to her. And yet, there was something about her that still drew him in. Something that made him wonder if, just maybe, there was more to her than what she let on. It wasn't until later that night, when Eleanor excused herself to speak with a few of her business partners, that Mark found himself standing alone. He was looking out at the crowd, half listening to the music, when a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "You look out of place," the voice said, pulling him from his reverie. Mark turned to find a woman standing beside him, a smile playing on her lips. She was dressed in an elegant gown, her dark hair swept up in an intricate updo. "Do I?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She chuckled softly. "Yes, you do. But don't worry, you're not the only one." She extended her hand. "I'm Vanessa." Mark shook her hand, still unsure of why this stranger was speaking to him. "Mark," he replied. Vanessa seemed genuinely interested in him, and for the first time in a while, Mark found himself actually engaged in a conversation. She asked about his background, how he came to be married to Eleanor. He explained the deal they had struck, how he was just a temporary solution to a problem neither of them had wanted to face. Vanessa listened intently, nodding as if she understood. "Sounds like quite the arrangement," she said. "But don't you ever wonder what it would be like if things were different?" Mark wasn't sure how to respond. He had never allowed himself to think about it. He had been so focused on the practicality of the situation that he hadn't allowed himself to imagine what a real marriage, one based on love and not a contract, might be like. Vanessa smiled, as if sensing his internal struggle. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "But sometimes, life has a funny way of making things real when you least expect it." Mark didn't know what she meant by that, but he couldn't help feeling a flicker of curiosity. He glanced over at Eleanor, who was still deep in conversation with a group of businessmen. The contrast between her icy composure and the warmth he felt from Vanessa was striking. For a moment, Mark wondered if this was what he had been missing: genuine human connection. The kind that didn't come with strings attached. As the night wore on, Mark and Vanessa continued talking, and by the time the gala was winding down, he realized that he had enjoyed their conversation more than he had enjoyed any of the others. Eleanor had been the perfect host, but Mark couldn't help feeling that she had been more of a stranger to him than anyone else in the room. Vanessa, on the other hand, had treated him like a person, not just a husband for the night. Mark found himself thinking about her words long after the event ended. Was he really living his life, or was he simply going through the motions? Was this arrangement with Eleanor really what he wanted, or had he simply settled for something that seemed safe and convenient? As Mark climbed into the car that would take him back to the apartment he shared with Eleanor, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing inside him. He had been living in a world of illusion, surrounded by wealth and status, but without the one thing that mattered most: genuine connection. And as he stared out of the car window, watching the city lights blur past, he couldn't help but wonder if he was ready to risk everything for something real. The next few days passed in a blur, but Mark couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he had with Vanessa at the gala. There was something about her that lingered in his mind, a spark of warmth he had not felt in the cold, calculated world of his marriage to Eleanor. As the days went by, he found himself searching for those moments of genuine connection, but they seemed harder and harder to come by. Eleanor remained as distant as ever, always the businesswoman, always in control. She never let him forget that their marriage was nothing more than an arrangement. It wasn't until another formal event, a charity auction, that things began to shift in ways Mark didn't expect. The charity event was held at one of the most exclusive venues in the city. Mark stood beside Eleanor, feeling out of place as usual. The room was filled with the city's elite, all dressed to the nines, exchanging pleasantries and bids on expensive artwork. Eleanor, as expected, was in her element, gracefully moving through the crowd, shaking hands, and making small talk with the wealthiest people in the room. Mark, on the other hand, felt like a shadow, standing in her wake, always on the periphery of the conversation, never truly part of it. As the night went on, he found himself retreating to a quieter corner of the room, nursing a glass of wine and watching the crowd. It was then that he saw Vanessa again. She was standing across the room, dressed in a sleek black dress, her dark hair cascading down her shoulders. She was talking to a small group of people, but her eyes kept flicking toward Mark. When their gazes met, she gave him a small, knowing smile. Without thinking, he made his way over to her. As he approached, Vanessa excused herself from the group and turned to face him. The following week, Mark couldn't stop thinking about the moment with Vanessa at the gala. It had been a small conversation, just a few words exchanged, but it had made him question everything he had been living for. He hadn't realized how suffocating his life had become, how much he had allowed the arrangement with Eleanor to consume him. He had been so focused on surviving, on fixing the mess his life had become, that he had forgotten to ask himself if he was truly happy. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Was he living the life he truly wanted, or was he simply going through the motions, stuck in a cycle of duty and convenience? Mark knew he couldn't ignore this feeling forever. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, that his relationship with Eleanor was just another part of his carefully curated life. He had already made up his mind, but what came next? How would he face Eleanor, the woman he had promised to marry without love, the woman who had been his savior and his jailer? Would he have the courage to confront the truth, to break free from the expectations they had both built around their arrangement? It was late one evening when Eleanor finally confronted him. They had just returned from yet another event, a private dinner with potential investors. The car ride back to their shared penthouse was silent, the tension in the air palpable. Eleanor sat next to him, her eyes scanning the city through the tinted windows, as if she were lost in thought. But Mark knew that the moment was coming, the moment when the facade would crack, when they would finally have to face what they had been avoiding. As the car pulled into their building's parking garage, Eleanor turned to him. "Mark," she said, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. "I know something's been off. You've been distant lately. You've barely spoken to me since that last event. What's going on?" Mark hesitated. He knew this was the moment. He couldn't hide anymore, couldn't pretend that everything was okay. He took a deep breath, turning to face her, and for the first time in a long while, he looked her in the eyes, really looked at her. He saw the woman who had offered him security, but also the woman who had locked him into a life he never chose. "Eleanor, I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. This whole arrangement. It was supposed to be temporary, a way out for both of us. But I don't know anymore. I don't know if I can keep pretending that this is enough." For a brief moment, Eleanor's expression softened. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the softness disappeared, replaced by a mask of coldness and control. "So, you've been thinking about leaving?" she asked, her tone laced with an emotion Mark couldn't quite read. He nodded, not knowing what else to say. He had known this conversation would be difficult, but he hadn't expected her reaction. "You think it's that easy?" she continued. "You think you can just walk away from everything we've built? Everything I've done for you?" Mark's heart sank. He hadn't expected her to react this way. He had hoped for understanding, for some recognition of the emotional weight he had been carrying. But instead, she was angry, defensive. "I didn't ask for any of this, Eleanor," he said, his voice growing firmer. "You offered me a way out of my debts, but that's not the life I want. I don't want to keep living this lie, being someone I'm not. I want to feel something real." Her eyes hardened as she leaned back in her seat, crossing her arms. "And you think you'll find that with me? You think you'll find real love and connection just because you decide to break this contract? You're just a pawn in this game, Mark. You've always been. You think you can just throw it all away?" The words hit him like a punch to the gut, but for the first time, Mark felt something shift inside him. He realized he didn't need Eleanor's approval anymore. He didn't need to justify his feelings or his choices. This wasn't just about the contract, this was about his life, his future. He wasn't going to let fear and guilt dictate his every move. "I'm not throwing it away, Eleanor," Mark said quietly, his voice steady. "But I need to live my life on my terms. I can't keep pretending that this is enough. I need something real." For a moment, the car was silent, the tension thick between them. Eleanor stared at him, her eyes hard and unreadable. Mark couldn't tell what she was thinking, but he knew one thing for sure: their life together, the one they had built on convenience and necessity, was coming to an end. He had finally found the courage to say what he needed to say, and though it terrified him, he knew it was the right choice. Whatever came next, he was ready to face it. As the car came to a stop, Mark opened the door, ready to step out of the world he had known for so long. He wasn't sure where he was going or what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was no longer afraid of taking that first step. The next morning, Mark woke up to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. He had barely slept the night before, the conversation with Eleanor still echoing in his mind. He reached over and grabbed the phone, squinting at the screen. It was a message from Vanessa. "I hope you're okay. Let me know if you want to talk. I'm here." Mark felt a small pang of relief wash over him. It had been days since he'd spoken to her, and despite everything going on with Eleanor, Vanessa's message felt like a lifeline. He quickly typed back, "I'll call you later." After a few moments, he stood up and stretched, trying to shake off the heaviness that had been hanging over him. Today was a new day, and for the first time in a while, he was ready to face it head-on. He spent the rest of the morning thinking about his conversation with Eleanor. He had expected anger, but not this level of coldness. It was as if she had already shut him out, as if she had moved on from their arrangement the moment he expressed doubt. But Mark couldn't be angry with her. He had agreed to the contract knowing exactly what it was. He had always known that this was never going to be a real marriage. The problem wasn't Eleanor, it was him. He had let himself get lost in the comfort of the arrangement, of the stability it brought, without realizing that he was sacrificing something far more important, his happiness. Later that afternoon, Mark found himself sitting in a small cafe, the same place he had visited when he first arrived in the city. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air as he waited for Vanessa. When she walked in, he stood up, his heart racing just slightly. She looked as beautiful as ever, but it was her warmth that he felt drawn to. She smiled at him as she sat down across from him, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief just being in her presence. "Hey," Vanessa said softly, her eyes full of concern. "How are you?" Mark paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. He had so many thoughts and feelings swirling around in his head, but he didn't want to dump all of it on her. "Not yet." "I'm okay," he said, his voice lacking the conviction he wanted. "I finally told her. Eleanor, I mean. I told her I couldn't keep pretending." Vanessa nodded, her expression understanding. "That must have been hard." "Yeah," Mark admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I thought I was ready for it, but it was still harder than I expected." He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "I just don't know what comes next. I feel like I've been living someone else's life, and now I have to figure out who I really am." Vanessa's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing a hand on his. "You're not alone, Mark. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Life doesn't always have a clear path, but you can start walking in the direction that feels right for you. You have time to find yourself again." Mark stared at her hand on his, feeling the warmth of her touch seep into him. There was something so comforting about her, something that made him believe that everything might just work out. But he knew it wasn't that simple. "I don't even know where to begin," he confessed. "I've been so focused on surviving, on keeping my head above water, that I've completely lost sight of what I really want." Vanessa smiled softly, her eyes kind and gentle. "You don't have to have all the answers, Mark. You just need to take it one step at a time, and you don't have to do it alone." Mark felt a lump form in his throat as he looked at her. It had been so long since he had felt this understood, this accepted. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. That maybe he wasn't too far gone to find happiness again. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything Mark had been carrying slowly starting to lift, if only just a little. After a while, Vanessa spoke again. "Mark, I know this isn't easy, and I know you're probably scared. But I want you to know that I'm here. If you need someone to talk to, or if you just need someone to listen, I'm not going anywhere." Mark looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had never expected to find someone like Vanessa, someone who cared so deeply without expecting anything in return. He realized that, for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Vanessa gave him a reassuring smile, her eyes warm and filled with sincerity. "You'll figure it out, Mark. You're stronger than you think." As the afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows, Mark felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was beginning to believe that things could get better. He had a long road ahead of him, but he knew he wouldn't have to walk it alone. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of clarity and confusion for Mark. He had finally admitted to himself that he couldn't keep living the way he had been, stuck in a marriage of convenience that had long since lost its meaning. But now that he had made the decision to confront Eleanor, he was left with the overwhelming question of what came next. He was no longer bound by the contract, but he had no clear direction. He knew he couldn't go back to the life he had before, one filled with endless stress, financial strain, and the crushing weight of living for others' expectations. Yet, stepping into the unknown was terrifying. The safety net he had lived under for so long had vanished, and Mark wasn't sure where he would land. He found himself at the same cafe with Vanessa again, seeking solace in their shared moments of quiet understanding. The two had spent more time together in the past week, and each conversation seemed to reveal more of the life Mark had been missing. Vanessa listened with patience, offering him advice, but more importantly, she gave him space to sort through his thoughts. It was something he hadn't realized he needed until he had it. One afternoon, as they sat at their usual table, sipping coffee and talking about their lives, Vanessa asked him a question that made him pause. "Mark, have you ever thought about what you really want to do? Not what's expected of you, not what feels safe, but what makes you feel alive?" Her question hung in the air, and for a moment, Mark was silent. He hadn't really thought about it. The idea of pursuing his own dreams, his own passions, seemed so distant from the reality he had been living. But now, with his life in upheaval, the question suddenly felt more urgent. He looked at Vanessa, who was watching him intently, waiting for an answer. "I don't know," Mark admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what makes me feel alive anymore. I've spent so many years just trying to survive, just trying to keep my head above water." He paused, his thoughts swirling in his mind. "I used to dream about being a lawyer, about fighting for justice, helping people. But I got caught up in everything else: my debts, my family, the life I thought I was supposed to have. I forgot about what I wanted." His voice cracked slightly as the weight of it all settled in. Vanessa smiled gently, offering him the same warmth and encouragement she had since the moment they met. "It's never too late to start over, Mark. You just have to believe that you deserve it." Her words were simple, but they felt like a lifeline, one that Mark hadn't realized he was desperately reaching for. She wasn't just offering him advice, she was offering him hope. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of his past decisions beginning to feel lighter. He wasn't sure where this newfound clarity would lead him, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of possibility. He wasn't alone in this journey anymore. Vanessa had become more than just a friend, she had become a reminder that there was still a chance for him to create a life that felt authentic, one that was his own. The contract with Eleanor had been the first step, but now he needed to take the second. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. Later that night, as Mark returned to the penthouse he shared with Eleanor, he knew the time had come to face her again. The silence between them had been deafening since their last conversation. Eleanor had been distant, her coldness like a wall between them. But Mark couldn't live in that silence anymore. He couldn't keep pretending that he was content with their arrangement. He had to be honest with her, for both their sakes. As he walked through the door, he found her in the living room, the dim light casting shadows across her face. She looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "Eleanor," Mark said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of what he was about to say. "I think we both know this isn't working. The arrangement, the contract, it's not enough anymore. It was never enough. I'm not the person I was when we first made this deal, and I'm not sure who I'm becoming. But I know I can't keep going like this. I need to leave." His words were firm, but his heart raced with uncertainty. He wasn't sure how she would react, but he knew he couldn't go on living in this half-life. Eleanor's gaze softened, but there was no anger, no harsh words. Just the quiet acceptance of someone who had known this day would come. "I knew this was coming," she said, her voice calm. "You've changed, Mark. And I can see that now. I won't stop you, but I want you to know that this was never easy for me either." Her words were simple, yet they carried a weight of their own. Mark stood there, feeling the finality of the moment. It was the end of a chapter he had never fully understood, but it was also the beginning of something new. He wasn't sure where the road would take him, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to walk it. Whatever came next, he knew he would no longer be living someone else's life. The days that followed were filled with a mix of freedom and uncertainty for Mark. He had made the decision to leave Eleanor, to break free from the contract that had once seemed like his only way out. But now, standing on his own, he realized how much he had relied on the security it had provided. The apartment he had once shared with Eleanor felt too large, too empty without her presence, and the weight of the future seemed heavier than ever. For the first time in years, Mark was truly on his own. He had no plan, no backup, and no one to lean on except himself. But even in the midst of his uncertainty, Mark knew one thing for sure: he couldn't go back. He had chosen to take control of his life, to step away from a relationship that had never been real. It was scary, yes, but it also felt like the first step toward reclaiming his own happiness. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, one filled with challenges and unknowns, but there was a strange comfort in knowing that he was finally living for himself. It was a few days later when Mark decided to reach out to Vanessa again. He hadn't seen her since that night at the cafe, and as much as he appreciated her support, he hadn't been sure what to say to her. But now, with his life in limbo and the weight of the past few days pressing down on him, he realized that he needed to talk to someone who truly understood him. He sent her a simple text, asking if she had time to meet up. Vanessa replied almost immediately, "Of course. I'm free tomorrow afternoon. Meet me at the same place?" Mark smiled, grateful for her unwavering kindness. He agreed, and the next day, they met at the cafe once again. The familiarity of the place felt comforting, a small piece of stability in the chaos of his life. Vanessa was already there when Mark arrived, sitting at their usual table with a coffee in front of her. She looked up when he entered, offering him a warm smile. "How are you?" she asked, her tone gentle, as if she already knew the answer. Mark sighed, sitting down across from her. Vanessa listened carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. "Mark, that's okay," she said softly. "You don't need to have it all figured out right now. You're allowed to take your time, to explore what feels right for you. You've spent so many years putting others first, following a path that wasn't your own. Now, it's time for you to find your own way." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. But it's hard. I've never had to think about myself before. I've always been focused on making sure everyone else is happy, on keeping up appearances. Now, I feel like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff, not knowing what's below or where I'll land." Vanessa reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "You don't have to jump right away. Sometimes, taking a small step forward is enough. The next right step will show up when you're ready for it." Her voice was steady, calm, and Mark couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over him. There was something about Vanessa's presence that made everything seem less daunting, more manageable. "Thank you," Mark said quietly, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you." Vanessa smiled, squeezing his hand. "You'll figure it out, Mark. I believe in you. Just take it one day at a time." Mark sat there for a few moments, soaking in her words, the warmth of her touch, and the sense of clarity that had slowly begun to take root inside him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Maybe this was the beginning of something new, something better. He didn't know exactly where his journey would take him, but he knew that he was no longer afraid to take the first step. As he left the cafe, Mark felt lighter than he had in days. For the first time, he didn't feel burdened by his past or the weight of what he had left behind. He was ready to face whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew he wasn't alone. And for now, that was enough. Weeks passed, and Mark found himself slowly adjusting to this new chapter of his life. The weight of uncertainty had started to lift, and though the future was still unclear, he began to feel a sense of freedom he had not experienced in years. He took small steps toward finding what he truly wanted, not just for himself, but for the kind of life he wanted to build. His conversations with Vanessa became more frequent, and she continued to be his sounding board, offering support without judgment. She was there when he decided to take up his law practice again, not as a corporate lawyer for high-paying clients, but in a way that felt true to him, focusing on the people who needed his help the most. Slowly, he started to rebuild his life, one decision at a time. One evening, after a long day of work, Mark found himself standing in front of a small gallery downtown, a space that had been the subject of his dreams for years. He had always wanted to create a place where art, creativity, and community could come together, but he had never allowed himself the time or freedom to pursue it. But now, with the support of Vanessa, he had started to make those dreams a reality. The gallery was small, intimate, and had a warmth to it that Mark felt drawn to. It wasn't much, but it was his. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly proud of something he had built on his own. As he walked inside the gallery, his thoughts drifted back to his conversation with Eleanor. They had been in contact a few times since he left, but it was always brief and businesslike. The distance between them had grown, and Mark realized that as much as he had once relied on the stability she offered, he had outgrown the life they had shared. Eleanor was still a part of his past, but she no longer had a hold on his future. And that was okay. It had taken him a while to come to terms with it, but now he knew he had made the right choice. Vanessa walked into the gallery just as Mark was lost in his thoughts. She smiled warmly at him, her presence bringing a sense of calm he had come to cherish. "How's everything going?" she asked, her voice soft and inviting. Mark smiled back, his heart full of gratitude. "It's going great. I'm finally starting to see the bigger picture." He gestured around the gallery. "This is just the beginning. It feels right. It feels like I'm finally doing something that matters to me. Not just something I had to do, or something I thought I should do. But something I really believe in." Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Mark. This is exactly what you deserve. A life you can be proud of, a life that's your own." She paused, her smile softening. "I always knew you had it in you." Her words filled Mark with warmth, and in that moment, he knew that no matter what had happened in his past, he had finally found his path. They stood together in the gallery for a few moments, both taking in the significance of what Mark had created. It was more than just a physical space, it was a symbol of his journey, of his growth. And with Vanessa by his side, Mark realized that he was no longer alone on this path. There was still much to do, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready. Ready to embrace the future, ready to pursue his dreams, and ready to build a life that was truly his own. As they stood there, surrounded by the art that would soon fill the walls of the gallery, Mark felt a deep sense of peace. The road he had taken hadn't been easy, but it had led him to this moment. And in that moment, he knew that he was finally living a life that was authentic, a life filled with purpose and love. "Thank you," he whispered to Vanessa, his voice full of emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you." She smiled softly, her hand resting gently on his arm. "You did it, Mark. You found your way. And I'll be here, cheering you on every step of the way." And with that, they both looked forward, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together.